Good morning, everyone. It's finally sunny in Washington. My name is Suzanne Brown Fleming, and I am the host of today's First Person program, and we really appreciate your joining us. This is the 17th year of the First Person program, and today's first person is Frank Liebermann, who we will meet shortly. The 2016 season of First Person is made possible by the generosity of the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation with additional funding from the Arlene and Daniel Fisher Foundation, and we are very grateful for this sponsorship. First Person is a series of conversations with survivors of the Holocaust who will share with us their firsthand accounts of their experiences. Each of our first-person guests serves as a volunteer at this museum, and this program will continue twice weekly through mid-August. The museum's website is listed on the back of your program and provides information about each of the upcoming first-person programs. The address is www.ushmm.org, and anyone interested in keeping in touch with the museums and its programs can complete the Stay Connected card in your packet or speak with a museum representative at the back of the theater. In doing so, you can receive an electronic copy of Frank's biography so you can remember and share his testimony after you leave today. Frank will share his first-person account of his experience in a question and answer session for about 45 minutes, and then you will have the opportunity to ask Frank your own questions. We will be live streaming today on the museum's website. This means that people will be joining this program via a link from the museum's website and watching with us today from around the country and around the world. And a recording of this program will be made available on the museum's website. We invite those who are here in the auditorium today to also join us on the web when the rest of our programs in April and May are live streamed. Visit the First Person website listed on the back of your program for more details. For our web audience, welcome. And if you would like to use Twitter to ask a question, send a picture, or write a comment during the program, please feel free to do so using hashtag USHMM. The life stories of Holocaust survivors transcend decades. When you're about to hear from Frank, you will hear his individual account of the Holocaust, and we're going to go through a very brief slide presentation to help me to introduce Frank. This right. This is Frank as a child who was born in Gleiwitz, Germany, now Poland, in 1929. Frank was the only child of Hans and Lotte Liebermann. And here we see on the left his father, Hans Liebermann, and on the right his mother, Lotte Liebermann, holding Frank's granddaughter, which he will tell you about later. Now, both of Frank's parents' families had lived in this part of Germany, now Poland, for several generations. Frank is pictured here with his paternal grandparents, Bernard and Jenny Liebermann. Now, when Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, and when Frank began school in 1935, Jewish students were separated from non-Jewish students, and fear of anti-Semitic acts and attacks became frequent. Here is a picture of Frank's first grade class on the first day of school. You might wonder what the totes they are holding are. They are totes containing sweets to make the first day of school sweet. And Frank is on the second row, fourth from the right. In 1936, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail in a bit, Frank's father was no longer able to practice medicine as a result of anti-Jewish laws, and in 1938, the family tried to obtain visas to come to the United States. Hans traveled first, and Frank and his mother followed a few months later in October 1938, and here is a picture of Frank's mother's ticket to the ship they took to the United States. And with that, I'd like to invite Frank to the stage so that we can begin our conversation together.
Hi.
Well, Frank, it's a delight and a privilege to know you and to have you be a volunteer at this museum, and I know what a gift you're going to be to our audience today. And I'd like to start with your childhood. The picture of you in first grade with your class, can you tell us a little about those very early memories of your childhood in Germany?
Well, I grew up in what I would call a middle-class home. We lived on the main street, something like Connecticut Avenue, which had a streetcar and public transportation because cars were pretty rare. And my father had the office when you came in, and the apartment was in back of the house. We had basically a 3-bedroom apartment. I was pretty independent and had what I would say a fairly normal childhood for the first, when I recall going way back, about as far as my memory stretches. It changed pretty drastically in 1936, when a treaty protecting minorities was abrogated and the Nazis fully took over. The treaty of the peace treaty of the Crimean War, which established Poland, protected minorities on the Polish side of the border and the German side of the border for 15 years. That was over in 1936. And at that time, you found that the Stürmer, which is a propaganda newspaper, was posted in every street corner. There were blockades of Jewish stores. We had no access to parks, swimming pools, and basically found safety in going in alone or in small groups so that we wouldn't be noticed by anybody. And that made me pretty independent. I rode my bicycle wherever I wanted to, and but you developed instincts for your safety. That's about.
I want to go back to the context of Gleiwitz a little bit to give our audience a sense of the place. This was a well-to-do, prosperous town, about 1,000 Jewish families in the town, so a significant Jewish population. And can you tell us a little about what your parents did for a living and your grandparents, and what their standing and place in the town was prior to Adolf Hitler?
I had two sets of grandparents, obviously. One lived in Oppeln, which is now called Opole. It was a provincial headquarters. They had a wholesale leather business which celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1933. They felt very secure, in fact so secure that they didn't consider emigrating when we did, because they said this will blow over. My other grandparents lived in Dayton, which is about 20 miles away from Gleiwitz. In other words, my parents settled in Gleiwitz because it was within easy reach
Was
of
the marital
both,
compromise?
of both families. And they had a hardware store on the main square and struggled with the living, but both my father and his brother went to college. My father's brother was an economist who, by the way, lost his job in 1933 because he worked for the government while my father studied medicine and was a surgeon in Gleiwitz.
So you were born at a time when at your birth your parents had a secure existence. Their parents and grandparents had been in then Germany for decades, and you are born into a world that changed rapidly. And by the time you were in school in 1935-36, a whole new set of regulations was in place. What was it like on a day-to-day basis in school for you? I know Jewish children were separated from non-Jewish children.
Well, we had basically 3 classrooms within the school with separate teachers. The most dangerous part of the school day was recess, which was around noon, where we had to go outside, and the more or less safest area where we could go was the dividing line between the boys and the girls who were separated in the playground. And there we had our teachers more or less keeping order. And we did get out 5 minutes early so that we could rush home before the rest of the school got out.
Do you remember anything about your neighbors and how they treated you and your family in these difficult years of the 30s?
Not really, because we were on the first floor, or rather, what is the second floor, and had the neighbors would be upstairs, and I had no neighbor experience that way. Since I mentioned we live downtown, so
Yeah.
Downtown isn't like living in the suburbs where you know your neighbors.
And the other Jewish families in Gleiwitz, did they live nearby, or?
It wasn't that big a city. We had a group of probably about 8 families who shared what was called the Schrebergarten, which is a plot of a garden, maybe half an acre, which was our playground, safe playground. We had cherry trees, a pear tree, and that was a place where we went on weekends or after school, and I had no hesitation. It was a place where you could take an easy bike ride, and that was kind of a safe haven.
Do you remember when your parents first started talking about trying to emigrate?
My mother took a trip to Israel in 1936 with her brother. Found out that in Israel, there's 1 doctor for every 100 people. And people with education, physicians particularly, were working on kibbutzes and chicken farms because there was no way that he could continue in his profession, and we started to investigate elsewhere, because after 1936 we had warnings that we had to make a change. In fact, just before the end of the treaty, which I believe was in July, my parents had me go to the swimming pool to take urgent swimming lessons, because there's a strong possibility that we'll take an ocean voyage, and they wanted me to learn how to swim,
So
which I did.
Your parents already by 1936 were investigating possibilities. And what about the rest of your family at that time?
I mentioned before, they felt so secure. They survived starvation in World War I with some bartering, because they sold leather goods to farmers.
Yeah.
And they said, we don't want to, and the other ones want to say, we don't want to be burdens.
And your father, when did he lose the ability to practice medicine?
They started having blockades of the so-called SR, which were kind of the beer hall Nazis when Hitler took over. As soon as that treaty was over. And his practice went down very substantially. He also lost his hospital privileges as a surgeon. So he was still taking care of some people who chose to come, but the SR people were threatening any non-Jews with employment threats, that they would tell their bosses and there would be consequences. My grandparents' business went down from that time from about 100,000 marks, which at that time was substantial, to about 20 when the business was confiscated during Kristallnacht. They had a non-Jewish accountant who kept the records, which, by the way, is in the museum files. I donated those.
And we're lucky you did. Now, your father took a trip to the United States in June 1938. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yes. My grandfather did a genealogy study for my parents and found that a distant cousin, not that distant, but goes back a generation before, had emigrated to the United States in 1905. And we also had a history of Gratz, which was the Gratz family, and settled, emigrated to the United States, or rather to the colonies in the middle 1700s, and were a pretty leading family in Philadelphia. You may have, a book was written about Rebecca Gratz and Gratz College. So he went to the archives in Philadelphia to see if there was any family who could help. Unfortunately, Rebecca Gratz never married, and her brother emigrated, rather went west to Louisville and lost track. There was no, so that the expedition to Philadelphia was a bust, but he did find Charlie Marcus, who was a son of the person who left, who had a substantial job in New York, and who eventually gave us an affidavit. That's how we got to the United States.
And
He brought that back. An affidavit is a signed document that we will not be on welfare for 1 year after arrival.
And the quota was quite small at the time, in
25,000,
1938.
and
Yeah.
was rarely filled.
It's terrible. So your father went to the United States in June 1938. You and your mother?
No, he went in January,
In January, okay.
and we, at that point, we got a number from the State Department
Okay.
To be eligible for the quota in 1938.
Okay. And you and your mother followed in October, so there was this gap where your father was in the United States and you and your mother were still in Gleiwitz with conditionings worsening all the time.
Well, we got our visa in end of June 1938. My father took the next boat because all bank accounts were frozen. You could only withdraw enough to prove for living expenses. Therefore, it was illegal to take any money out except for 10 marks, which is about $2.50. By today's inflation figures, I put that as $50. In order to live, if you took a German ship, you were able to get a pretty good spending allowance on the ship, which could then be transferred out. We used that for living expenses. The visa was good for 120 days. We purposely booked it after 3.5 months so that we had some money to live on when we arrived.
Was your mother afraid? Were you afraid?
Fear wasn't an option. If you decide to do something, you do it. And my mother's, both parents were made up their mind, and we had to do whatever we had to do.
I remember reading about a medical incident that you had when your father was already in the United States and you were back with your mother. Do you want to mention that to the audience and what being Jewish meant in that situation?
In playing, there was also a building which we could use. I took my bicycle to it, and we were playing tag. I fell, I broke my arm. Or at least I fell and it hurt. So there was no way of calling anybody, like the police or 911. I took my bicycle and rode home this way, made it fortunately. My mother immediately called the orthopedist at the hospital and was told, sorry, he isn't treating any Jewish people and he can't help. She frantically got on the phone and found an orthopedist in my grandparents' town in Dayton, that's my father's parents, who, by the way, were no longer living there. And he said we should take a taxi to the Catholic orphanage at the edge of town and take the delivery entrance. He would meet us there, and he set the arm and gave instructions to my pediatrician on what exercises to do after, I think, 6 weeks after the cast came off. But that way, that was taken care of.
Still moves.
My left arm is fine.
Your poor mother with that first response.
Yeah.
So in October 1938, you and your mother boarded a ship for the United States. Can you tell us about your voyage?
When we took the Europa, which was one of 2 ships of the Norddeutschen Lloyd, had a cabin way in the front because we took the cheapest cabin in first class in order to get the spending allowance. And when we got to Bremen, there was no ship. We were told that the ship would arrive the next day, and we did board. We stayed overnight. And when we got on the ship, we found out that during the Munich negotiations, when England and France sold the Czech Republic down the river without their consent and gave away the Sudetenland, which is the border area with Germany, Hitler called back all ships at sea as part of a war threat, and the ship was called back from Cherbourg and was 4 days late in September. By October, it had made up 3 of the days, and we were the last one because the ship took 6 days to cross Atlantic and had 1 day to turn around. So it caught up, and we made the ship in October during the hurricane season, where my mother was terribly seasick, also probably emotional exhaustion. And at one point, I was one of 6 people in the dining room. The other 5 sat at the captain's table. I had a table for myself, which I thought was great.
So before we leave Germany altogether, in your story, what is your best memory and your worst memory prior to getting on that ship in October 1938?
My best memory was probably my mother's family were expert mushroom pickers. And they did this on a yearly basis, going to the country to a particular forest. I have no idea where it was. And at the end of the picking, they took everything home. They were spread out on a table, and anybody had veto power. Every one of the mushrooms, as you know, there are many different varieties. And anyone vetoed, they weren't eaten, and my grandmother made wonderful feasts with the mushroom crop. Worst memory probably is when my mother's brother came with us to Bremen, and I saw him cry.
And you were 9 years old at the time?
Yeah.
And where did you land in the United States?
New York.
New York. And was your father there?
My father picked us up. He had come to New York by Greyhound. I got a sightseeing tour on a two double-decker Fifth Avenue bus, which showed me Central Park up the Upper West Side, and we stayed 2 days, and then took the Empire State Express to Cleveland, where he had rented a one-bedroom apartment where I had a Murphy bed. I don't know if you guys know what a Murphy bed is. You open a door in the living room and you pull the bed down. And I thought that was a great invention.
So a month following, you had already mentioned the pogrom of the Night of the Broken Glass, and your family was still in Cleveland. Do you want to tell us how you heard the news?
On the 9th of November, we had been to Cleveland for 2.5 weeks. My parents decided to ask a neighbor to look in on me. We were in an apartment house in Cleveland. And they went to a Wednesday night movie special. I don't know if it was 10 cents or whatever it was. And I think it was from 8 to 10. At about 9 o'clock, the phone rang, and I got on. It was a person-to-person phone call from my grandparents. I knew it was bad because it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and since it was person to person, I didn't talk to anybody, but I heard conversations on the other side. And that was probably the worst hour of my life until my parents came home. Because I knew things were bad. I didn't know what it was, and I had to spill the beans when they came back.
And what did you
That
have?
was Kristallnacht,
Yes.
when the business was confiscated. 2 of my mother's brothers were imprisoned, and that was technically the start of the Holocaust. In other words, we escaped it, and I consider myself a witness rather than a survivor, because I didn't go through that part, but many other people here did.
And what happened to the brother that saw you off at Bremen?
They were returned. They came back. He was one of the 2 who was arrested. He came back. They managed to get papers to go to Hong Kong, rather to Shanghai. There were 2 places which were issuing visas to refugees at that time. One was Shanghai, by the way, under Japanese occupation. The other one was, just a second, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which invited people to come in for their expertise. And they were on a boat, on an Italian boat in the Mediterranean on the day that Italy declared war on Britain and France after Hitler got to Paris with the breakthrough in June 1939. No, June 1940, excuse me, which led to the fall of Paris. The ship was returned, and they eventually all died in Auschwitz.
And your family in the United States moved from Cleveland to Dayton, I believe?
Yes.
And is that where you grew up?
Correct.
From age 10 on?
Correct. And it was a wonderful place, especially at that time. It became a boom town. And I went to elementary, high school, and college in Cleveland.
You know, I remember reading that your father became very active in the HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, now that he was in the United States. I would love for the audience to hear a little about your father's work once he came to the United States.
First of all, when my father came to the United States, I don't want to go too long, but we had an interesting experience. He applied for the Medical Society, which was at that time a license to good standing. Shortly after he applied, they called an emergency meeting, which on a Friday night, which is a Jewish Shabbos, and passed an ex post facto law requiring citizenship for membership. And in other words, in trying to veto
Yes, because your father
his
didn't
admission.
Have it. Yes.
Somebody, we never knew who it was, called the newspapers in outrage. And on the following Sunday, there was an editorial in the Dayton Herald on freedom of opportunity in the United States. The next day, he had 11 new patients and became rapidly established. By the way, also, after that veto, he had a visit from the chief of staff of Good Samaritan Hospital, who said this is an outrage, and he offered him staff privileges. And we felt very fortunate that we resettled, and I had a very, very happy childhood in Dayton. He volunteered every Wednesday and Thursday mornings to do draft examinations after 1941. In Memorial Hall, they did the concert. The concert hall was used as, he volunteered for the army, but there was such a shortage of doctors that he was rejected, and that they wanted people under 40, which was kind of the peak.
Yeah.
And basically, that's the end of that story, except that we didn't know what was happening during all of World War II, because my grandparents were in Theresienstadt until 1944. We never heard from my mother's brothers who were on the way to Hong Kong, where I learned afterwards that they ended up in Auschwitz, together with my 3-year-old cousin, who obviously had no chance of making it.
Yeah. Well, I would like to make sure we give our audience a chance to engage with you also, Frank, and let me turn to that portion.
By the way, I'd like to say one other thing,
Of
which I
course.
was asked before.
Yes.
I went back to Germany for the first time when the city of Gleiwitz, which is now Poland, dedicated a memorial to the contribution of the Jewish community in the growth of the city, because Upper Silesia was a coal mining area. Unfortunately, brown coal, which was highly polluting, but we didn't know that. Nobody knew that at the time. But they dedicated the memorial, and I decided at that point to take my family. We all flew into Berlin and went, first of all, we met in Berlin and spent some time there. I wanted to hate it, and I couldn't. We went to the dedication and introduced my kids to where I came from, which they enjoyed. And it was interesting that Poland was interested in writing their history and learning about it. I have since gone back to Germany a couple of times. I've kind of made peace with the country and now look at it as that James Comey gave a speech. He's the head of the FBI, gave a speech here that said that he insists that agents come to the Holocaust Museum in order to see what can happen when law enforcement gets out of control. And he said at that point he redefined the word humanity. I always learned that humanity shows a good side, but he said we have to realize that humanity also has its dark side, which we have to control. I therefore look at what happened almost generically, that in bad times, people sometimes look for quick fixes, and they can have disastrous consequences. I have to say that I'm an American. I consider myself an American patriot. I've had a chance to live the American dream, and I want my children and grandchildren and yours to have the same opportunities.
Before we turn to our audience, I want you to know that it's our tradition in first person that our first person will have the last word. So after our Q&A, I will ask that you remain seated so that you all hear Frank's closing remarks. And after he does give those closing remarks, we're going to ask all of you to stand so that our photographer can take a picture of Frank with you in the background. And also, Frank will remain here on stage so that you can come up and ask him any additional questions and shake his hand or take a photograph with him. We do first person every Wednesday and Thursday until the middle of August. I hope you don't miss these opportunities if you're able to take advantage of them. And our recordings are available as well. And so now to turn to your questions.
By the way, I didn't answer your question. I like to add that because I'm proud of my family.
You should be proud of your family.
My father received the 75th anniversary award of International Highest, which is a resettlement organization, together with President Truman and 3 others, and has been interested in philanthropy and paying back to the opportunities which we've had in the United States. You can consider this as my closing remark.
Those of you who do want to ask Frank a question, we have microphones on each side of the aisle. I'm actually going to first turn to the one Twitter question, which will be on display behind me. Let's see. What do you hope students get out of their visit to the USHMM? Great question.
Basically, what I mentioned about the vulnerability of humanity to see, to be influenced by events which, let's say, to learn from our mistakes. Now, we all make mistakes, but unless we learn from them and we learn history, we tend to repeat them. And there are especially 2 exhibits here which are scary because they're from the last 50 years. Cambodia and Syria. Now, people still haven't learned, and that's why students are so important for this museum.
We invite you to come to the microphone and ask Frank any question on your mind. We know you have questions. Here comes. Excellent.
You mentioned having some friends on the playground at school. Have you been able to follow back on those friends to see where they ended up?
You mean from Europe?
Yes.
Unfortunately not, because of the immediate group, most of them didn't make it.
Thank you.
I wish I had a more positive answer.
Were there concentration camps already established in the late 30s, and were your parents aware of them?
Yes. Dachau was outside of Munich, was built almost immediately after the Nazi takeover in 1933. They were obviously expanded greatly after the famous Wannsee conference, which established the final solution and how to do it. But the German name Konzentrationslager was prevalent pretty much from the beginning.
Yes.
You're a scholar of
that's right.
that era.
The first concentration camps were established within months of Adolf Hitler's accession to the chancellorship. And the first prisoners were Jews, but also communists and socialists and homosexuals and so-called asocials. And the number of concentration camps exploded rapidly. For the Jewish population of Germany, the first anti-Jewish laws were also quite immediate, just like camps. April 1933 were the first anti-Jewish laws, which began a series that culminated in the Night of the Broken Glass pogrom that Frank mentioned. And all of these things, the laws against Jews and other so-called outsiders and camps, were in the newspaper every day and accessible information to everyone.
Your dad being a doctor, was he ever, or do you know if he was ever involved in the mission where they were doing mercy killings on the handicapped children and the handicapped people?
I don't think that really is a more recent priority. Am I correct?
Yes, I think, ma'am, it's a great question. You're talking about the T4 program to murder Germans with physical or emotional handicaps.
It was part of the Nazi agenda.
Yes. So,
but it didn't really become an American agenda, I would say, until when was it? 70s? 80s?
Well, your father, for example, as a Jewish physician, would have been excluded as a staff member considered worthy of such an important job to the Reich. The euthanasia program, I think, began in the late 1930s by that time, but no Jewish physicians would have been allowed to be involved because they were victims themselves.
Did you ever fear that even when you were in America that they would try to come and get you and the rest of your family?
Well, this is why we left school early. In other words, it was more you develop your own instincts. It was safer individually. You wouldn't then as a group. You generally didn't go anywhere in groups for your own safety. Does it answer your question?
First of all, Mr. Liebermann, thank you very much for sharing your story. I wanted to know what was the greatest challenge that you faced when trying to make peace with your past and all you went through?
I'm sorry, the greatest challenge of what?
What was the greatest challenge that you faced when you were trying to make some peace with your past and everything you went through? Was there any moment that you were in a certain building and remembered something?
I basically feel that hate is a dangerous thing. You have to come to terms with whatever happened and react in a thoughtful way that's going to be constructive. So I said I didn't want to go back until there was another occasion. But I just felt grudges don't accomplish anything. So I don't think it was that big a challenge.
Thank you.
Well, we've got time for one last question from our other side of the aisle.
Hi, I'm from Mexico and I have an uncle who survived the Holocaust. He just passed away like a year ago, and he never wanted to say anything about his story or his family. He never wanted to say nothing about the history. He was very affected. So my question is, what would you say to the survivors that's still alive to speak and to say everything who passes? I don't know, what would you recommend for them to go and speak to the people or to their families?
So I'm going to repeat the question
Yes.
just so that it's
Sorry.
clear for our...
There's an
for our-
echo, it's hard to hear.
Yes,
Sorry.
it's okay. For our streaming audience, The young lady here has a grandparent who is a survivor from Mexico, and your grandparent, as I understand, was very deeply affected and couldn't talk about it. And this young lady would like to know, what do you advise on being able to talk about this to other generations?
My grandchildren and children pushed me to do it because it's part of our heritage. And we want to know. We want to know about it. It only adds to the respect. And we went through quite an issue with my mother finally wrote an autobiography. And my parents did get interviewed because an issue is always better when it's in the open rather than when it's suppressed. You don't accomplish anything by denial. Even though I have to say that the Holocaust was denied for one whole generation, both in Germany and elsewhere, because it was too horrible to deal with.
Yes. Well, you still get the last word, Frank. I'm still going to ask you to close our program. And remember that after closing it, you need to stand up so we can take your photo with the audience in the background, and then we'll have all of you come up and meet Frank, but please give us your closing words.
All right. Unfortunately, since I'm a substitute today, my family wasn't able to get here. I was called 2 days ago because somebody got sick. So I have to say, first of all, said before, I'm happy that I've been able to live the American dream. I have 3 children who are now approaching senior citizenship age, and 5 grandchildren.
Shocking, right?
One of whom, by the way, is studying modern European history. He's working on his PhD. Another one is at Harvard Law School.
Wow.
The other ones are just working people. And one, by the way, is a teacher, which is a profession I admire greatly. She teaches high school English in Brooklyn.
Wow.
And I'm happy to be where I am, and I hope that I was somewhat enlightening in your view of history and how important it is to study it.
Well, please join me in thanking